Hello and welcome to the AHR podcast, where we will be engaging in captivating conversations about the built environment and its influence on shaping a more positive future. I'm Imran Kassim. I'm a director and part of the Schools and Colleges sector group at AHR. I've been with the business just over 20 years, and I've spent most of that time working on schools and colleges. And in today's episode, we'll be discussing school design, how it's evolved and what's influencing it today. I'm joined by two very clever colleagues, Stuart Bryson and Natasha Karson, from our Glasgow and Bristol offices. Hello and welcome to you both.
Hi, Imran.
Hello, Stuart.
Imran.
Hello there. So I'd just like you to both just give us a bit of a brief overview of your experience in relation to the topic that we're going to be discussing today. So, Natasha, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, my name's Natasha Karson, and for the last 5 years, I've been part of the education team within the Bristol office, working on special educational needs settings, all the way up from early years provision, primary school, secondary school, and I've worked on some university projects also.
Perfect.
Hello, Imran again. Yes, I'm Stuart Bryson, and I'm a regional director, and I run our Glasgow office. I've been with the HR for over 20 years now, and I've enjoyed delivering over 40 different education projects, ranging in type and scale from nurseries right through to schools, colleges and university campus work. Education is really at the heart of everything that we do out of the Glasgow office. It's exciting work, and we've enjoyed delivering a proactive and practical professional service in the education sector.
Excellent. So we've got two very experienced people to talk about our subject matter today, which is brilliant. We're going to be covering 3 discussion points, if that's okay with you two. Our first discussion point is to cover the evolution of education design. Now, in my time, like Stuart, I've been doing this for a couple of decades now, and the way that we've approached schools design and college design during that time has, I think it's fair to say, evolved. Lots of different things have been, new demands have been put on us as designers, but also the nature of education to some extent has changed as well. So current thinking around sustainability involves net zero quite a bit. And I'm sure Stuart will be talking to us about Passive House as well up in Scotland. As educational curriculums have changed, our approach to education design has changed as well. When I first started out, it was very much the fashion to talk about open plan learning, project-based learning. But as time has gone by, certainly these last 10 years, successive education secretaries have championed a more classroom-based approach. And that may well be cyclical. There was a time in the 60s where we were very much more wedded to open plan spaces in our education settings. And then the third thing, really, the third subject area within this that I wanted to cover was also how we're approaching our different sites in our relative locations. We've got, certainly in England, there are fewer and fewer open sites available, certainly where we're building new schools, where we're looking at tighter urban sites, and the way that we approach design when dealing with those tighter, more constrained settings, I think does inevitably influence what we do as designers. So they're the kind of subject areas that I'd like to cover, if that's okay. So I think it's also useful to note that given we're kind of spread across the UK, we're working in various parts of the UK nations. So, Natasha, you've done a bit of work in Wales from the Bristol office, and Stuart, obviously, from Glasgow, covering our Scottish region. I'd like to start really by just talking about the various differences in approach. Certainly in England, there was a time where, when I first started, we were working with local authorities. There was very much a localized approach to brief setting and meeting school education need. But nowadays we work for the DFE, which is a much more centralized organisation. And that comes with its benefits as well as its challenges. Some of its benefits are that the DfE demand much, much greater levels of building performance, as I mentioned before with net zero, which perhaps has come quicker than it might have done through our local authorities. So, Natasha, would you like to just tell us a little bit about Wales and perhaps how the Welsh experience when it comes?
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, as you said, across AHR we work nationally, but the Bristol office and our more recently opened Cardiff office are really well placed to serve the Welsh clients. So one thing that you just mentioned in terms of local authority versus academy and versus DfE input into projects, that's one clear difference between Wales and England, in that Wales don't have the academy system. So we're dealing directly with local authorities, and that leads into some of the performance requirements for each of those projects. So Wales have an ambitious net zero carbon in operation criteria for all new projects, and local authorities at an individual level can set their own determined embodied carbon targets. We also have another very standard sort of practical requirement across all those new projects, which is to have a sprinkler provision in all schools. So that leads into some of the design and planning challenges. And then from a classroom perspective of the teaching approach, there is a trend towards trying to incorporate more SEND, which means special educational and emotional needs students, into classroom settings as much as possible, and what's called in-class intervention. So that has a direct impact on how you plan out spaces. In some cases, we actually are able to have a little bit more space per student than you have in some of these more urban environments, but not necessarily in every case in Wales. But we do try to incorporate those additional needs of students. There might be a different socioeconomic mix in some of these more challenging sites. And there's also a language extra challenge of having Welsh and English curriculums. Some schools are actually Welsh first and English second. So that adds more complexity into making sure that we're meeting all of the needs of all of the users of those buildings.
Fantastic. So it does appear to be a fairly different in many ways, and I think certainly the cultural differences and the geographical differences are brought to bear in that design. That's really interesting. Do you think, Natasha, in Wales, because there are fewer people, let's say, and so they build fewer schools, do you think that they take perhaps a bit more time and have a bit more of a focus on design quality as part of their output?
Definitely that's reflected in the performance requirements of net zero carbon, and I think they are ahead of many other areas in having sprinkler provision. In terms of meeting the needs of the local community, obviously it varies place to place, both in England and Wales and Scotland, but there are some areas we're working in where there is extreme deprivation, that there are extra challenges to make sure you're bringing the whole community up with this new development. There's a lot of co-location of social care, which I don't know is quite so prevalent in English schools. So to make sure that the new building or the addition to a building is also serving the broader community, that everybody benefits across the age ranges.
Okay, fantastic. And then we go to our other UK nation, Scotland. Stuart, would you like to tell us about the Scottish experience?
Well, I think it's fair to say, Imran, that Scotland enjoys some better space standards than you do in England. Certainly being part of the education focus group when we sit down as a collective group together, it's really interesting to see the differences between the nations and that approach. Scottish local authorities and or kind of education departments, those that are commissioning schools, they do tend to have a far greater say in what their specific requirements and their needs are, and of course the performance standards that come with that. Now, authorities in Scotland can self-fund a project themselves if they want, if they're lucky enough to have the capital to do so. However, those that need to secure funding do have to comply and are led by an organisation called the Scottish Futures Trust, and they manage the Scottish Government's Learning Estate Investment Programme. That's commonly referred to as the LEIP. And there have been many phases of that over the past number of years, and that's government releasing funding to local authorities to build new schools. Now that SFT and LIP, it does set out area metrics, but importantly, as Natasha has been saying, it sets out energy performance standards and low carbon standards to achieve. And compliance with those standards is how a local authority will get their funding. But the metrics for each school depends on pupil role and the overall size of the school building. But there's no set design standard per se for the education requirements of each school. That is up to the local authority to decide, provided they can still build within the overall metrics. Now, what we do see, and it's really exciting for us, perhaps not for you, and I know that our colleagues get quite excitable. We enjoy far greater, square metre rates, glazing proportions, volumetric sizes, circulation widths, breakout spaces, learning plazas, bespoke shared spaces. These are all spaces that we enjoy designing, and our local authorities would demand of us. And we know that perhaps your DFE is perhaps a far more centralised and tighter requirement. But one of the latest in Scotland is Passive House. Now, we're lucky to be designing two large Passive House projects at the moment, one being the largest Passive House project in the UK. And local authorities are using that as an approach to achieve their low energy in use metric and thereby complying with the SFT metrics. Now, as we know, Passive House is a quality control design process in its own right that defines energy performance, ventilation, heating. All of these parameters are now affecting the quality of the education space that we're delivering.
Okay, so it sounds like that Scotland has taken the sort of the net zero outcome target to the next level, taking us to Passive House, which is a much more stringent, more sustainable standard, I would say, and perhaps we might start to see that in the other UK nations. I do know that we've had the DFE have commissioned some pathfinder schemes in England with regards to that, and I wouldn't be surprised that they'd be pushing us even further in this geography. Stuart, you were going to just say something there.
We were recently at the Passive House Trust UK, recently held their this yearly conference in Edinburgh, which we went to, and we were lucky enough to be presenting their keynote speech, presenting our Dunfermline Learning Campus project. But some really good developing discussions there, because it would appear the uptake of local authorities adopting the Passive House standing is really starting to inform government standards. And there is an approach now that Passive House might actually start to inform building standards and technical compliance as well. And it might become the norm. So that's really exciting. And it's probably actually one for us to come back for another podcast to discuss Passive House in its own right.
I think it'll be a discussion in itself. I'm going to move us away a little bit from sustainability then, and I'm going to talk about how schools design, education design has developed and has had to change and react to the availability of various differing sites. So I mentioned at the introduction that in England we are looking at many more urbanised sites, much more tighter sites, but across the UK nations, we have a sort of a difference in that experience. Some more open sites still, some semi-rural sites that we work on, as I'm sure we can imagine in Wales and in Scotland. So, Natasha, do you want to just give us a bit of an insight in your thinking around the differing approaches to looking at a tighter site as opposed to a more sort of open semi-rural setting? What are the differences in architectural thinking when you look at a site like that?
Well, we often refer to these site analysis early days as opportunities and constraints. And I think there are both when you have an urban setting versus a more rural one. So obviously you have more space to lay out potentially on just one story or maybe over just two stories when you have a more rural setting and you have more estate to expand into. But there are often constraints even when it looks like a very large site, because you'll have sport facilities that are very tightly controlled, and no one wants to lose sports facilities that are often shared by the community. So there's often less freedom than you may think on a large rural site. Looking at urban sites, obviously it's very clear that you are limited within your red line and you cannot go beyond it. So you do typically see beyond even 2 stories, maybe 3-story, 4-story constructions. And there are clever spatial planning tricks that can be played where you can stack spaces intelligently and often find some good economies there. If you're stacking spaces vertically and in closer proximity to one another, you might lose less of your square footage to circulation, for instance, and you might be able to get efficiencies for how you're getting your services into spaces like food tech next to your kitchen, for instance. But there are obviously much more design challenges there to get adequate daylighting in and make sure your ventilation is good, and ideally to pick out some good views a bit further beyond the school site so that there is a feeling of spaciousness as much as possible, even in a small school site. I think it's always a case of looking at the individual site. Every school is different in its approach, in its staffing, and in its school cohort, its local community, and just as much so, we look at every school building and its school site and those constraints and opportunities just as much in an individual sense, and look for how we can maximise the use of that space.
Very good. So really, it's taking a site-specific approach to really eke out the opportunities that would provide without sort of lessening any of the benefits from daylighting and shielding our activities and educational spaces from noise and such like is what I'm hearing there. I was wondering, we'd worked on a scheme where we put a pupil social space onto the roof, and there's been a few schemes like that. And I wonder whether that will become more commonplace with regards to urban settings. I mean, you've talked about sports provision, and perhaps there'll be a further reliance on sports provision elsewhere. So what do you think about that, Natasha?
Yeah, I definitely think what's, dimmed the Overton window, there's these changes and new approaches taken. There's been some multi-award winning projects in London and in urban settings that do utilise more of the roof space. And I think people are more accepting now that is the way things are going. So it is easier, the more projects that have a slightly less traditional approach to school planning out of the grounds and are using roof spaces, that becomes the norm and is more accepted. And it's a great use of space. You can double up in a way that might not have been thought possible before. I lived in New York for a couple of years, and there every school has a rooftop sports or playground. It's just the norm in Manhattan and Brooklyn. That's the only thing you can do. So I think people do tend to compare schools to the school they went to and whether it meets their picture in their head of what a school looks like and how school grounds should be. But obviously we're at the cutting edge of school design and we're seeing what can work and always looking for a new solution, which may not necessarily be the previously accepted solution.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you've made there, and we'll come back to that. What do we imagine a school to be like in our mind's eye? And it usually is quite a nostalgic view. So we'll come back to that. It's really important. Thank you. Stuart, you were just about, you wanted to contribute to this point.
I was just about to say I'm not been as lucky to been working in schools in New York, but certainly across the wider geographic area of Scotland, we have delivered small village schools to wider super campus, and we've enjoyed that spectrum of work. But one of the key points there and some of the challenges, and Natasha hit there about community and about sports, we're finding that some of the schools, if they're perhaps a wee bit more remote, you then actually start to be, not only is a school already the hub of a community, but it starts to bring in police facilities, healthcare facilities, shared community use and community type spaces. And you have that full spectrum of almost like public sector facilities can actually start to be included within the school design. And of course that brings across new challenges about access and security and keeping people safe. But the key driver there, and the really exciting thing is that they really become that heart of the community, and that's where you really drive better facilities.
So I'll move us on to our second discussion point today, healthy teaching spaces. So I suppose the first question is, what constitutes a healthy space? Now, this is something that the DfE in England have tried to define to some extent. Circles around building performance, particularly relating to ventilation in internal spaces and daylighting, and the demands made on our designs as architects and as broader design teams involving engineers has been to have a much more predictable and tested and modelled outcome that meets some fairly stringent requirements with regards to those two criteria. But also there's a probably more recently a greater emphasis and focus on wellness as well. And then also some of the other softer things around colour and internal space and finish that we have to think about, particularly for younger learners. In addition to that, keeping with the healthy spaces theme, there is a greater emphasis now, particularly in the DfE, about the quality of landscape externally and the amount of greenery, and using our school projects for new schools and new sites to act as a force, if you like, for reversal of biodiversity loss, inclusion of green roofs and such like on our buildings. And then also what I wanted to cover was something that Natasha had mentioned, which I thought was a really interesting thing around the school as a psychological construct. So schools are the subject of many happy memories for lots of us, not all of us, but lots of us. And what I wanted to do was just explore a little bit how perhaps what we think how good architecture can help with forming those positive emotional responses. So I'll start again with you, Natasha. What does your approach involve when considering a healthy teaching environment?
Well, you've touched on some of the fundamentals already, Imran. Good lighting is essential. Good ventilation is essential. There has been multiple studies proving that to improve concentration, academic performance, staff retention, having good air quality and excellent connection and visual connection to ideally nature, but at least to views outside, if not of nature, really do help people's experience of that building. And I think it's really important, obviously, for any building that we're designing, we want to make sure that that internal quality of space is suitable for the functions of that space, but there's good quality of light, that the temperature doesn't fluctuate beyond people's comfort zone. But it's even more essential in school and college design, because these are our young people. They deserve the absolute best. And they very often, especially the younger they are, have very little agency. They didn't choose to come to school that day. They have to be there all day. They haven't chosen to be in that space the way that most adults choose their internal environments. So it's even more important, especially the hard and very valued job that all of the teaching staff are doing, that we give them the absolute best internal environment we can. And that obviously feeds into psychological pleasure and psychological connection and feeling of belonging to that space. Because if you're uncomfortable, it's hard to then form any further positivity of your experience beyond that discomfort, whether it's a cold draft or not being able to properly hear what the teacher's saying. So we need to make these spaces really functional, really comfortable, and a pleasure to be in, so that then the teaching staff can build on that foundation and give everyone a great experience.
That's great. That I think the importance around creating an environment for children who have no agency, I think, is a really, really central and important theme that architects have to grapple with. Stuart, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I always like to put ourselves in the shoes of the pupil, a day in the life, and understand, what they're going through. We must never forget that pupils spend the majority of their younger years in school. So that space has to be right. It has to be welcoming. It has to be safe. It has to be healthy. And we know that our own and pupil well-being is influenced by the environments that you live and work in. What's exactly the same for a school pupil. and the quality of their education academic development is very much going to be influenced by the quality of the space and the environment that we provide for them as architects designing their new school.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. So lots of similar themes there. I guess from some of my thoughts around this is that we've talked about education settings being, obviously very child centric, and the child being at the centre of our thinking when it comes to design. But schools are also workplaces, and I suppose they do lots of other things as well, as Stuart's mentioned. And one of the experiences we've had, particularly when working with school trusts, is speaking to them how we can create workspaces that help them with their staff productivity, but also with retention as well. Happy staff are probably staff that will stick around a bit longer. So provision of convenient car parking facilities or sustainable transport facilities, and then things like showers for those that arrive by bicycle has been something that has featured very heavily in some of our conversations with those trusts, as well as adequate office space as well to support all of their work outside of the classroom. So yeah, lots to chew over there. In terms of landscape and greenery, then, we've talked about urban sites, we've talked about more open settings. Some of the things that we're experiencing, I've certainly experienced with discussions with DFE teams, has been the idea of including more greenery, measuring biodiversity, making sure there's a net gain in biodiversity. A lot of that has to do with the landscape, but it also has to do with the design of the roofscape and including green roofs and in some instances green walls into our buildings and into our designs. I wondered, Natasha, whether you had any thoughts around greening up a building, and whether that was something that you find sort of an opportunity, or whether it's something that's probably best left to gardeners.
No, definitely. I think it has to be integral to the master planning, and the planning of all the spaces need to be connected to their individual site, and getting, as you said, as many opportunities for nature and biodiversity to come onto that site as possible. It's something I'm pretty passionate about, actually, because I went to school in inner city London, and it was actually a pretty big site, but it was almost entirely hard landscaped, and there wasn't really many trees or much greenery. And it's so important. Children are, by and large, very naturally drawn towards gardening and natural landscapes, and obviously it feeds into the curriculum in many ways, to feed into science learning, so that can become actually a teaching space as well as something to obviously add to that psychological well-being of a child using the space. You can sit under a shady tree in summer and do lessons outside, so there's an advantage not just sort of practicality wise but also emotionally. And we are trying to serve a local community. Almost every school has neighbours around it, at least on 2 or 3 sides at the very least. So the more beautiful we can make the school site, everyone can have a sense of pride, civic pride for that new development, and enjoy that space.
Brilliant. Stuart, I know the Glasgow office has had some experience in this, I think with your Madras College project and the provision of outdoor teaching spaces, which hopefully have involved some greenery. So would you like to tell us a little bit about that and how that panned out?
Well, yes, I can. But one of the benefits of AHR is our multi-service approach. We have our own landscape architects department. So we have landscape architects based out of our Glasgow office. So they work very closely with our architects. So we're very lucky. But landscape is key to everything that we do, that indoor-outdoor mix of spaces. Now, you mentioned Madras there. We created in a combination of indoor and outdoor courtyards, fully landscaped with a range of different materials, soft and hard landscaping, different types of settings for outdoor teaching. And we've carried that across into our Dunfermline Learning Campus and doing exactly the same thing. And one of the key spaces in both of those projects is actually the inclusion of a Department of Additional Support who have very specific outdoor teaching spaces. And that includes things like vegetable patches and growing and outdoor suds, ponds where it can be used for biology, etc.
So SUDS were sustainable urban drainage solutions.
Absolutely, yes.
Very good.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, that sounds like a real wide repertoire of interventions that hopefully go to make a really useful and sustainable space for the children that we're designing for. I wanted to move us on into our final sort of point under this heading of healthy spaces, and that's just talking about the school as a psychological construct. So this is something that really interests me. Whenever we talk to a new client about a school and how they might imagine it to be, more often than not always, but more often than not, they describe the school that I went to, and which essentially is a low-rise school, lots of green playing fields, in a very nice setting. There's a river at the end of the football pitch. I went to school in Bury, which is a lovely place. What I find amazing is that it's always very similar, and it's always quite nostalgic, and it does make me think about how people see schools, how they feel about them, and what it is that makes people think in that way. But that always then leads me on to try and understand and to explain, as I suppose to agree with them, how good architecture might help our clients to elicit these sorts of feelings for the children of the future and the ones that we are designing for. So, Natasha, would you like to sort of tell us one or two things that you think are important in creating positive emotional responses in the schools that we're trying to design and build?
Well, I think you've really hit the nail on the head in that it's such an emotionally charged subject, just like healthcare. It's a political hot potato. Everybody has an opinion about education. Everyone has had an experience. Everyone's been to school. A lot of people have also had children attending school or still attending school. So there's a lot of life experience and value judgments baked into people's opinion or their history within education settings. I myself have also taught in schools as well. So I have my own personal teaching and learning experience, teaching time, education time of my own, and then my own children attending school. So there's a lot of different real life experience baked into the theory of how we approach education design. And I think the fundamentals of architecture are true regardless of the building you're working on. But as I said before, those are so much more important to get right and to really make the effort to combine all of the different disciplines. We talk to our landscape colleagues, as we have also within the Bristol office, like Glasgow, we have landscape right there. We work very closely with all of our engineers to make sure those fundamentals of getting the space to be joyous, to be functional, to meet people's basic needs, that is the backbone of a good psychological experience.
And as you say, Natasha, it's about values, isn't it? It's about personal values to some extent, but then it's also about an institutional memory about what we all share and think about as a good place to send our children. Stuart, any offerings on this?
Schools are at the heart of our communities, and they must reflect, good design ethos, and they must be future-proof, they must be flexible, they must be adaptable. There are many challenges to designing a school, but we must never forget that we are not only are we designing for just now, but we're designing for today's generations, but the future generations, and all of the challenges that brings, whether it's changes in teaching styles, methodologies, technological advances, and that's where the depth of our experience and what we've been doing and everything that Natasha has been saying, demonstrates AHR's ability to do so.
Fantastic. Yeah. So you brought us beautifully into our third discussion point, which is the idea of community and inclusivity. And as you say, Stuart, the AHR approach to schools design is understanding how they are rooted in their community and how they serve that community. I think, for me anyway, schools are one of the few building types where we expect them to do the widest number of functions and accommodate the widest number of activities, probably short of hospitals to some extent, but in schools we expect them to be community buildings, to be workplaces, to be places where we care for our children, to be sports places, as well as restaurants and classrooms and all the rest of it. So we do demand a lot from our schools. When it comes to community, we always talk and try to bring out how a school can serve its local community when it's not doing its core functions as a school during the school day. So that's something that I'd like to just to discuss and try and understand our approaches around AHR on that. And then secondly, looking at the inclusivity side of things, I just wanted to speak a little bit about how when it comes to more specialist schools, what our approaches might be. Our understanding of SEND needs in children has grown exponentially over the last couple of decades, and more specialist schools are being built. So how does good design answer some of the challenges around those sorts of school types? So we'll start with the first point around community. Stuart, would you like to, you left us beautifully on that note around community. What is it that makes a school building more useful to its community? How can that be amplified in using a good architectural design?
Well, I think the real joy comes from developing a school as a hub building, Imran. They're getting that community setting, they're getting all of these facilities all to be in the one place and to be inclusive is really key. And of course, for a local authority client, that drives good value for money and it gives them best value. We have, as I mentioned earlier on about our geographic spread, we have schools that have local theatres, sports clubs, and then very specific sports clubs, swimming pools, squash, etc. But we also have examples of adult learning and out of hours learning, adult learning, community learning, and things like, a good example is tractor workshops, believe it or not. That's there for CDT, technical classrooms for pupils during the day. It's then used for adult learning in the evenings, but then it's actually there for the local agricultural community to then go and use at weekends as well. That's real great value in providing, and these are exciting spaces.
I think that's a really important point, Stuart, that we've talked about schools as sort of high-performing spaces in terms of building performance. We've talked about schools as being emotional spaces and creating great memories for those that use them. But they are also a value proposition for the organisations that are spending enormous amounts of money getting them designed and built. So getting them to work hard through their design, I think, is really important. So that's a brilliant point. Thank you for that. Natasha, I'll just move to you. What are your thoughts on the sort of the community proposition around schools?
Yeah, well, building on what Stuart said, most local authorities and schools are under tremendous financial pressure at this time. So not just to serve the community and give better value for building a new provision and making sure that meets lots of other community needs, but it also often gives the school some lettings income from letting out spaces for swimming classes or using the sports hall or the theatre, the various additional uses that can be found in the evenings to really double up the use of that space and really help in the financial standing of that provision. The complexity of those spaces, as we touched on, you're often designing not just teaching spaces, but workspaces. You might have healthcare provision, theatre, restaurant, specialist sports provisions. One of the fundamental roles of AHR when we're looking at the architecture of these spaces is the space planning and the adjacencies of certain spaces, because within all of that complexity of the use we're providing, there's also an inherent importance to make sure that you are safeguarding children from making sure that you've got a secure line around where the teaching spaces are, making sure play spaces are appropriate, and also the practicalities of renting out certain aspects, certain parts of your school estate independently to different users who might be key holders that just want to use one sports facility or the theatre. So that really feeds into how we plan out the master plan and plan out the use of the school building, that you might need more than one entrance. How can you control access, make sure that spaces work well together and are easily separated out for different users at different times? So that is very much part of making spaces more inclusive, in making sure not only are they safe, but that they're legible, that someone that is new to that site can arrive and easily find their way to the part of the building they need to use and can easily and safely and securely access that, regardless of their physical abilities.
Fantastic. Well, another amazing segue into the second point, which is around inclusivity and how the things that we need to do as architects and designers to make our school buildings as accessible as they need to be to allow access to the more vulnerable or challenged in the school cohort. We as designers look at not only specialist schools more and more these days, but we also look at specialist units within mainstream schools that generally act as a stepping stone for children who are moving back into mainstream education. Some of these spaces have quite stringent performance standards, both acoustically and also physically, for those that might have challenges with mobility, but also, say, for instance, children who are on the autistic spectrum and may need to have highly controlled environments within which to learn. How does good design start to address some of these challenges, do we think? Stuart, any experiences from you, any insight from you on this?
Well, yes, we've delivered quite a few additional support need schools or special education needs or ASN departments, etc. within schools. It's always a challenge, and I think you touched on a lot of the design challenges that are required. What we like to do, one of our approaches is always taking cognizance of that inclusivity approach. You want pupils to be included within the school so that they're part of the wider school community, but yet at the same time balance their needs to be slightly separate and more specialist areas. And that actually goes for the staff provision who are looking after those staff as well. So that it's not just for the pupils, it's staffing as well. One thing that we like to incorporate, and it's working with our interior design department, is the use of colours, graphics. And you can, in some circumstances, have bright, vibrant colours, but at the same time, other areas might require more muted colours, more considered, calmer environments. That then brings in a whole range of graphics. We talked earlier on about almost bringing in biophilic design, so materials and touch and senses, etc., all need to take cognizance of that. We've talked about space, the size and the volume of these spaces. Again, you might want bigger groups to be taught in those spaces together to then be encouraging children to be in a wider group environment, teaching environment, but at the same time you've got to balance smaller one-to-one type spaces. So there's a real, just as you do in the wider school, within these special areas, you have to have a full range of different types of teaching settings, and that comes with its own acoustics and performance standards.
Thank you, Stuart. And Natasha, any thoughts from you? Any final thoughts from you on this?
Well, what I just add to what Stuart was mentioning, all the things that we need to make sure are included in our design, and also a very large part of what we do to try to make sure that the school performs well for everybody is actually editing things out. So you want to try to edit out unnecessary distraction, whether that be visual distraction, drafts, very loud noises in some cases. You're trying to edit out any confusion. So you try to make the space as easy to understand as possible and easy for people to find their way through. So it's actually often a case of what do we take away and make sure is not present just as much as what we want to include.
Fantastic. So it's a case of editing out what we don't want to hear and see, which is a really nice way of looking at it. So we've covered a lot of ground today, I think, with our subject matter. We've talked about our differing approaches across the UK nations and the various ways that we approach design and the built output that comes from that, both culturally and geographically. We've talked about the importance of delivering healthy spaces and the importance of landscape and greenery and how they interact with our buildings. We've talked about the community side of things and how our schools need to be rooted in their communities and can only be considered really successful if they are, and about how we make them work harder for our clients so they do deliver on that value proposition and they're used all year round and throughout the day. And finally, finishing on that importance of inclusion, having a really clever and experienced approach to delivering environments that can accommodate and help some of our more challenged students in society to engage in education. So I think that's a really fantastic way of finishing our discussion today, all of which would generate a whole podcast in themselves, I'm sure. So thank you for your brevity. Thank you for your experience and insights, Natasha and Stuart. We hope you did enjoy this episode at home. And just to say that you can find all our podcast episodes on our website, or you can subscribe via your preferred podcast platform. So thank you so much for listening. And just leaves me to say we look forward for you to joining us again next time.